Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. It looked ordinary when I moved in, faded blue, a little thin near the doorway. But after a few days, I began noticing the resistance. My feet would sink deeper than expected, as if the fibers were clenching around me. Walking across it feels wrong now. The texture changes beneath each step. Sometimes it clings, not like static, but like a grasp. I tested it with a heavy chair. The next morning, the legs had sunken several inches. I pulled it out with effort. Now, each time I cross the room, I feel it pulling slightly harder, like it's remembering me. The apartment came furnished, a convenience I appreciated after the stress of relocating. Everything seemed normal enough. Worn furniture, yellowed walls, and that carpet stretching across the main room like a faded ocean. The landlord mentioned it had been there for years, installed by the previous tenant who had lived here for decades. He spoke of her with the distant fondness reserved for reliable renters who paid on time and never complained. I didn't think much about flooring until I started working from home. My desk sat in the corner, requiring frequent trips across the room to the kitchen and back. Each journey felt increasingly laborious, as if walking through thick sand. At first, I blamed my new sedentary lifestyle, convinced my legs were simply adjusting to the change in routine. But the carpet began to hold impressions longer than it should. My footprints would remain visible for hours, deep indentations that seemed to deepen rather than fade. I found myself studying the patterns, noting how the fibers appeared to curl inward around each mark, creating small craters in the surface. The areas I walked most frequently developed a worn, almost polished appearance, but underneath, the carpet seemed to be growing denser. I started documenting the changes with my phone, taking photos from the same angle each morning. The images revealed subtle shifts that my eyes might have missed, slight variations in color, texture differences that spread like slow bruises across the surface. The carpet near the entrance, where I stepped most heavily, developed an odd luminescence, as if the fibers were catching and holding light differently than the rest. The temperature variations came next. Certain spots felt noticeably warmer under my bare feet, while others remained cold even after hours of afternoon sunlight. I pressed my palm against various sections, mapping the warm zones. They They seemed to correspond with the areas where the carpet gripped most firmly, creating an uncomfortable correlation between heat and resistance. When I tried to vacuum, the machine struggled more than it should have. The suction seemed muffled, as if the carpet was fighting back, holding onto dirt and debris with unusual tenacity. The vacuum would bog down in certain spots, the motor straining against an invisible force. I switched to a more powerful model, but the same thing happened. Resistance in the exact same locations. The sounds started subtly. A faint whisper when I walked across the room, barely audible above the ambient noise of the building. Initially, I assumed it was fabric friction or the settling of old floorboards underneath. But the whisper had a rhythm, a cadence that seemed almost conversational. I began walking more deliberately, listening for the pattern. It was there, soft, consistent, like someone murmuring just below the threshold of understanding. I recorded the sounds using my phone's voice memo app, playing them back at various speeds and volumes. The whispers became clearer when slowed down, resolving into something that sounded disturbingly like responses to my footsteps. Each time I stepped, there was an answering murmur, as if the carpet was acknowledging my presence. The smell emerged gradually, a musty sweetness that reminded me of old flowers pressed between book pages. It was strongest in the morning, fading as the day progressed, only to return stronger the next morning. I searched for the source, checking for mold, examining the walls, inspecting the heating vents. Nothing. The scent seemed to emanate from the carpet itself, particularly from the areas where the fibers had grown thick and lustrous. I began avoiding certain sections of the room, stepping carefully around the spots that felt most resistant. But the carpet seemed to adapt, expanding its grip to new areas, as if learning my patterns and adjusting accordingly. The safe zones grew smaller each day, forcing me to navigate an increasingly complex maze of troublesome patches. My ankles started aching from the constant resistance. Each step required more effort than the last, as if the carpet was steadily increasing its hold. I tried wearing different shoes, thick soles, thin soles, boots, sneakers, but nothing changed the fundamental sensation of being grasped with each footfall. The carpet seemed to recognize me regardless of what I wore. I researched carpet behaviors online, searching for explanations about fiber density, humidity effects, and settling patterns. Nothing matched what I was experiencing. The forums I visited were filled with discussions about worn carpets, stained carpets, carpets that shed or attracted pet hair. Nobody mentioned carpets that seemed to develop their own intentions. The neighbor upstairs mentioned that the previous tenant had rarely left her apartment in her final years. She described an elderly woman who ordered groceries online and had meals delivered. Someone who had gradually withdrawn from the world. The woman had died peacefully in her sleep. The neighbor assured me, found only after several days when the smell alerted building management. I found myself wondering about her daily routines, imagining her walking the same paths I now traveled, wearing down the same areas of carpet. Had she noticed the changes? Had she felt the increasing resistance, the growing grip of the fibers around her feet? The thought sent an uncomfortable shiver through me, as if I was following in footsteps that had never truly faded. The carpet's response to my presence grew more pronounced. Areas I avoided would return to their normal height and texture, while the paths I used most frequently became increasingly problematic. It was as if the carpet was learning, adapting, concentrating its efforts on the roots I couldn't avoid. I tried rearranging the furniture, forcing myself to walk different paths across the room. But within days, the new roots developed the same characteristics: the sinking sensation, the whispered responses, the warm spots that seemed to track my movements. The carpet appeared to be mapping my habits, adjusting its behavior to match my routines. The resistance reached a point where walking across the room required genuine effort. My feet would sink into the fibers, and pulling them free created small popping sounds, as if I was breaking tiny connections with each step. The carpet's grip had become so pronounced that I could feel individual fibers wrapping around my ankles, creating a sensation like walking through invisible webs. I decided to test the carpet's limits. Using a kitchen knife, I cut a small section from an unused corner, planning to examine the backing and understand the construction. The moment the blade touched the fibers, I felt a vibration travel through the entire carpet, a subtle shudder that seemed to pulse outward from the cut. The severed section felt different in my hands, warmer, almost alive, with a texture that seemed to shift as I examined it. The cut healed overnight. Not obviously, but the gap had closed, the fibers somehow reconnecting and weaving themselves back together. The repair was nearly invisible, detectable only because I knew exactly where to look. The carpet had regenerated itself, restoring the damaged area with perfect precision. I began walking on my tiptoes, trying to minimize contact with the surface. But the carpet seemed to sense my attempts at avoidance, increasing its grip proportionally. The lighter my touch, the more aggressive its response, as if it was determined to maintain full contact regardless of my efforts to escape. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I could almost make out words now, fragments of something that sounded like welcome, like invitation. The carpet wasn't just holding me. It was trying to communicate, to establish some form of connection that went beyond the physical sensation of walking across its surface. I stopped sleeping well, hyper-aware of every sound from the main room. The carpet seemed more active during the dark hours, shifting and settling with soft, rustling sounds that suggested movement. I would lie awake listening, imagining the fibers reaching upward, testing the air, searching for warmth and pressure. The morning I woke to find my slippers had sunk completely into the carpet beside my bed. I knew I had to leave. They were embedded so deeply that only the laces remained visible, the rest consumed by fibers that had grown thick and possessive during the night. I pulled them free with considerable effort, noting how the carpet reluctantly released them, stretching upward in thin tendrils before finally letting go. Packing became an exercise in careful navigation. The carpet seemed to sense my intentions, growing more aggressive with each item I placed in boxes. Walking across the room required genuine strength now, each step a deliberate act of will against the increasing resistance. The whispers had become a constant murmur, following me as I moved, growing louder whenever I approached the door. On my final night, I stood at the threshold, looking back at the carpet that had become my adversary. In the dim light, I could see the patterns of where I had created, the pathways of resistance that mapped my daily routines. The carpet lay still, waiting, patient in the way that only inanimate objects can be patient. But as I turned to leave, I felt a final tug at my ankle, gentle but insistent. The carpet had reached out one last time, a farewell that felt more like a promise than a goodbye. I pulled free and stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind me with relief. relief that felt premature. The new apartment has hardwood floors, smooth and predictable beneath my feet. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between waking and sleeping, I can still feel that gentle grip around my ankles, the memory of fibers that learned to recognize my touch. And I wonder about the next tenant, whether they'll notice the resistance, whether they'll feel the carpet learning their patterns, adjusting to their presence. The carpet doesn't want to be stepped on, but it needs to be. And somewhere in that need lies a hunger that no amount of distance seems capable of satisfying. Story 2. I try not to look at it anymore, but it's difficult. It hangs at the perfect height, unassuming. Still, I catch myself glancing. Sometimes, just before I move, the reflection shifts first. Not much, just a twitch of the mouth or a furrowed brow, a heartbeat ahead. I made faces at it once to test. It responded differently. Not wrong, just off, like it was feeling something I wasn't. The worst moment was when I stared for a full minute without moving. The reflection sighed, not annoyed, sad. It knows something I don't. Or maybe it's waiting for me to catch up. The bathroom mirror has been my silent companion for years. Every morning, the same routine. Brush teeth, wash face, quick check before leaving. But lately, something has changed. The glass feels warmer against my fingertips when I clean it, as if heated from within. The silver backing seems to shimmer differently, creating subtle ripples that shouldn't exist on a perfectly flat surface. I started keeping a small notebook beside the sink, recording the anomalies. The way my reflection appears to blink slightly slower than I do. How sometimes the light catches differently on one side of the glass, creating shadows that don't match the room's illumination. The most unsettling entry was from last week. Reflection smiled while I was frowning about the broken coffee maker. Lasted 3 seconds before correcting itself. The mirror's frame, old brass with intricate scroll work, has developed a peculiar resonance. When I tap it gently, it hums at a frequency that seems to vibrate through my bones. The sound lingers longer than it should, as if the metal remembers the contact. I've begun to notice that the humming changes pitch depending on my mood. Anxious thoughts produce a higher, more urgent tone. Calm moments create deeper, almost melodic vibrations. My reflection has started to look tired when I feel energetic. Its eyes carry a weight I don't recognize in my own face. The skin appears slightly paler, the posture more hunched. Sometimes I catch it rubbing its temples while my head feels perfectly clear. It's as if the mirror is absorbing something from me, or perhaps showing me what I'm trying to ignore. The notebook fills with observations that make less sense each day. Reflections, lips moved silently while I was thinking about Mother's letter. Hair fell differently on the other side, defying gravity. Steam from hot shower cleared everywhere except around the reflection's outline. The handwriting becomes more hurried, more desperate to capture details before they slip away. I've started leaving voice recordings on my phone, whispering observations while staring at the glass. The playback reveals strange background noises, soft breathing that doesn't match my rhythm, faint scratching sounds like fingernails on metal. Most disturbing is the electronic distortion that creeps into my voice whenever I describe the reflection's independent movements. The mirror has begun to fog on its own, without heat or humidity. The condensation forms patterns that almost resemble letters, but they dissolve before I can decipher them. I've tried wiping them away, but the cloth comes back dry, as if the moisture exists only in the glass itself. The fog appears most often when I'm brushing my teeth, creating a barrier between us that feels intentional. My reflection's clothes have started to differ from mine in subtle ways. A collar turned up when mine is down. A sleeve rolled higher on one side. These discrepancies last only moments before snapping back to match, but they're becoming more frequent. I've begun taking photographs, hoping to catch the differences, but the camera only shows what I expect to see. The scroll work on the frame has begun to feel softer under my fingers, as if the metal is slowly warming and yielding. I trace the patterns obsessively, finding comfort in their complexity. But lately, the designs seem to shift when I'm not looking directly at them. Curved lines become angular, floral motifs transform into geometric shapes. The brass feels almost organic now, pulsing gently like living tissue. I've started avoiding the bathroom during certain parts of the day. The mirror seems most active when the light is dim, creating an atmosphere where reality feels negotiable. But even from the next room, I can sense its presence. The air carries a faint ozone scent, like the aftermath of lightning, and I hear the soft singing of metal under stress. The reflection has begun to mouth words I can't quite read. Its lips move with purpose, forming shapes that seem urgent, almost pleading. I've tried to lip read, leaning closer to the glass, the meaning remains elusive. The communication feels one-sided, as if it's trying to tell me something I'm not ready to understand. My notebook entries have become erratic. It looked directly at me while I was looking away. The reflection's breath fogged the glass from the inside. Its hand pressed against the mirror surface, but I felt the pressure on my chest. The words blur together, written in a hand that grows shakier with each entry. The frame's vibrations have intensified, creating a constant low hum that penetrates my skull. I feel it in my teeth, in the hollow spaces behind my eyes. The sound follows me throughout the house, a persistent reminder of the mirror's presence. Sleep has become elusive as the humming echoes in my dreams. I've tried covering the mirror with a towel, but the fabric won't stay in place. It slides down slowly, deliberately, pooling on the floor in perfect folds. The glass beneath remains clear and expectant, my reflection waiting with infinite patience. Its eyes hold a sadness that cuts deeper than fear, a melancholy that seems to seep through the barrier between us. The final entry in my notebook reads, "It's not showing me what I am. It's showing me what I'm becoming." The pen ran out of ink halfway through, but the words continue, etched into the paper by pressure alone. Below, in handwriting that isn't quite mine, someone has written, "We're almost ready." The mirror no longer reflects the bathroom behind me. Instead, it shows a room I've never seen, with walls that breathe and shadows that move independent of any light source. My reflection stands in that impossible space, beckoning with fingers that pass through the glass like water. The surface ripples at the touch, and I feel an irresistible pull toward that other place. I am writing this with my back to the mirror, but I can feel its gaze like heat against my neck. The reflection doesn't need me to look anymore. It has learned to exist without my permission, to move without my movement. The boundary between us has become permeable, and I am no longer sure which side of the glass is real. The humming has stopped. The silence is somehow worse. Story 3. It began subtly, a metallic sharpness, a weight behind each breath. Then came the sweetness, faint but unmistakable, like the air was flavored with regret. I started waking up with a dry throat and that strange taste lingering, like someone had whispered sorry into the vents all night. Now, when I open the cabinets or move furniture, the taste shifts. Bitter, then sour. It's as if the apartment reacts to where I step, what I touch, like it's feeling guilt in real time. But I haven't done anything wrong, have I? The first few days, I blamed the building's old ventilation system. These walls have absorbed decades of cooking smells, cigarette smoke, and the accumulated breath of countless tenants. But this taste was different. It coated my tongue like a film, persistent and oddly personal. When I brushed my teeth, it would fade for mere minutes before returning, stronger than before. I began documenting everything. The taste was most pronounced near the kitchen sink, where a faint electrical humming seemed to pulse beneath the running water. I pressed my ear against the faucet and heard something that made my skin crawl. A whisper so soft it might have been the pipes settling, but it formed shapes that sounded almost like words, almost like my name. The smell came next, not the taste's metallic companion, but something entirely different. Vanilla and burnt paper drifting from the bedroom closet. I stood there, inhaling deeply, trying to place where I'd encountered this scent before. It reminded me of birthday candles being blown out, but with an undertone of something funeral-like, something final. I started keeping a journal, writing down every sensation, every anomaly. The pen felt heavier in my hand each night, as if the words themselves were becoming denser. The taste grew stronger when I wrote, flooding my mouth with that apologetic sweetness, until I had to stop mid-sentence and rinse my mouth. But even water tasted wrong now, carrying traces of that same metallic regret. The apartment's temperature began shifting without explanation. The thermostat remained constant, but certain corners would grow inexplicably warm, while others turned cold enough to raise goosebumps. When I touched the walls in these temperature zones, they seemed to vibrate slightly, as if something was moving just beneath the surface. The vibrations felt rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, but too slow to belong to any living thing. I installed recording equipment, small devices hidden in each room to capture whatever sounds might be causing this disturbance. The first playback revealed nothing unusual, just the normal creaks and hums of an old building. But when I listened with headphones, adjusting the volume to its highest setting, I could hear them, soft exhalations that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. They weren't quite human, but they weren't random either. They had a pattern, a cadence that felt deliberate. The taste began responding to my emotions. When I felt frustrated, it turned bitter. When I was sad, it became overwhelmingly sweet. When I was afraid, which was happening more frequently, it transformed into something indescribable, like the air had been seasoned with pure anxiety. I realized the apartment wasn't just affected by my presence. It was learning from me, adapting to my psychological state. My reflection started looking wrong. Not dramatically different, but subtly off in ways that took me moments to identify. My eyes seemed slightly wider, my mouth turned down at corners that had never drooped before. The mirror in the bathroom showed these changes most clearly. But when I looked at myself in the kitchen's reflective surfaces, I appeared normal again. I began avoiding the bathroom mirror entirely, but the wrongness followed me to every reflective surface in the apartment. The recordings grew more disturbing. Voices, definitely voices now, but layered and distorted until they sounded like a chorus of apologies spoken underwater. I could make out individual words: sorry, forgive, mistake, too late. They seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, even from inside the electronic devices themselves. I tried to leave, packing a bag and heading for the door, but the taste followed me into the hallway. It was weaker there, more diluted, but unmistakably present. When I returned to the apartment, it rushed back into my lungs like a wave of relief, as if the space had been holding its breath during my absence. The realization hit me then. I wasn't just experiencing something in the apartment. I was becoming part of it. Climax came when I found the source. Behind the kitchen wall, accessible only by removing a loose baseboard, was a small cavity. Inside, wrapped in plastic that had yellowed with age, were photographs. Not of me, but of someone who looked exactly like me. Same face, same build, but wearing clothes I'd never owned, standing in places I'd never been. The photographs were dated, spanning several years, and in each one, the person who looked like me appeared slightly more translucent, slightly more faded. The taste exploded in my mouth as I held the photographs. So intense it brought tears to my eyes. The apartment shuddered around me, walls groaning as if they were breathing. The whispers became screams, then faded to silence. In that silence, I understood. I wasn't the first tenant to experience this. I was simply the latest in a series of people who had been chosen, absorbed, replaced. Now I sit here, writing this account, and I can feel myself becoming less solid with each word. The taste has become my taste, the whispers my thoughts. When new tenants come to view the apartment, I I watch from behind my own eyes as someone who looks exactly like me shows them around, smiles, explains the quirks of the old building. They always sign the lease. They always move in alone. The photographs in the wall cavity have grown by one. My face stares back at me from the newest image, already beginning to fade around the edges. Soon, there will be someone else, someone who looks exactly like them, standing in this kitchen, breathing air that tastes like apologies, and wondering why they wake up with a dry throat, and the strange sensation that they've been saying sorry all night long. I haven't done anything wrong, but I'm beginning to understand that wrongness isn't always about what you've done. Sometimes it's about what you're about to become. Story 4. I never paid much attention to it. Just a few shelves, a hanging rod, boxes I rarely open. But I began noticing things were out of order. The shoes were flipped. A jacket turned inside out. At first, I thought I was forgetful. But then I placed a camera outside the door. Nothing moved. Yet inside, the layout changed again. One night, I left the door open just a crack. In the morning, it was wide open and empty. No clothes, no boxes, just space that wasn't mine. An architecture not designed for humans. They returned later, but not in the same place. The wooden floor beneath my feet feels different now when I approach that corner of the room. It gives slightly, as if the foundation has shifted imperceptibly. The air carries a faint metallic scent, like old coins left in a pocket too long. My fingertips brush against the door handle, and it's warm despite the coolness of the room. I started keeping a notebook. Each morning, I would sketch the arrangement of items inside. The winter coat on the left side of the rod. The running shoes paired neatly on the bottom shelf. The cardboard box marked with my own handwriting pushed against the back wall. By evening, subtle changes would emerge. The coat would hang 2 hangers to the right. The shoes would face the opposite direction. The box would rotate 90 degrees, its corner now pointing toward the door. The camera I installed captured only static images of an unchanged space. Frame after frame of the same configuration. Yet, when I opened the door, reality contradicted the digital evidence. I bought a motion sensor, placed it strategically in the corner where the disturbances seemed most frequent. It never triggered. No movement detected. No alerts sent to my phone. I began leaving small markers. A pencil balanced on the edge of a shelf. A crumpled receipt tucked into a shoe. these items would vanish completely, only to reappear in impossible locations. The pencil materialized inside a sealed box. The receipt emerged from the pocket of a jacket I hadn't worn in months. Each discovery felt like a message in a language I couldn't decode. The scent grew stronger, more complex. Beneath the metallic notes, I detected something organic. Earth after rain. Leaves in various stages of decay. Sometimes, when I pressed my ear to the back wall, I could hear what sounded like wind moving through branches, though the space beyond was only another room in my own home. My sleep became restless. I would wake convinced I had heard the closet door opening, the soft creak of the hinges echoing in the darkness. Each investigation revealed nothing out of place, yet the feeling persisted. I installed a light sensor that would alert me to any change in illumination. It triggered constantly, sending notifications to my phone throughout the night. When I checked, the closet remained dark, undisturbed. I decided to spend an entire night watching. I positioned myself with a clear view of the door, determined to witness whatever was causing these disturbances. The hours passed slowly. My eyes grew heavy despite my determination. In those moments between wakefulness and sleep, I saw movement in my peripheral vision. Shadows that seemed to flow like liquid across the floor. When I turned my head, everything was still. The morning brought the most significant change yet. The interior had been completely reorganized. Items I had never seen before hung from the rod. Clothing in styles I didn't recognize, made from fabrics that felt wrong against my skin. The boxes had multiplied, each one sealed with tape I had never used. The shelves themselves had shifted, creating an asymmetrical arrangement that hurt to look at directly. I tried to remove the unfamiliar items, but they felt anchored to their positions. The fabric of a strange coat seemed to merge with the hanger. A box refused to lift from its shelf, as if it had grown roots into the wood. My attempts to document these changes with photographs resulted in blurred images, as if the camera couldn't focus properly on these new additions. The temperature inside the closet began to fluctuate wildly. My breath would fog in the sudden cold, then dissipate in waves of unexpected warmth. The walls felt alive beneath my touch, pulsing with a rhythm that didn't match my heartbeat. I pressed my palm against the back panel and felt it give way slightly, as if the solid wood had become membrane thin. I started avoiding the room entirely. But the changes followed me. I would find unfamiliar clothing in my laundry basket. Shoes that didn't belong to me would appear by the front door. The disturbance was spreading, seeping into other spaces, transforming the familiar into the foreign. When I finally gathered the courage to return, the closet had expanded. The interior stretched back further than the dimensions of the room should allow. The far wall had receded into darkness, and I could hear echoes of my own footsteps bouncing back from impossible distances. The air current that emerged from this new depth carried scents from places I had never been. Flowers that bloomed in different seasons, soil from unfamiliar ground. I reached into the extended space, my arm disappearing into the darkness beyond the original back wall. My fingers touched something smooth and cool. When I withdrew my hand, it was covered in a fine dust that glittered in the light. The substance had no scent, no texture I could identify. It clung to my skin like a second layer, and no amount of washing could remove it completely. The closet door began to resist my attempts to close it. The mechanism would catch, leaving a gap that seemed to widen on its own. Through this opening, I could see movement in the extended space. Shapes that might have been fabric swaying in an unfelt breeze, or something else entirely, something that only resembled the familiar objects I had once stored there. I sealed the door with tape, but found it open again the next morning. The tape remained intact, yet the door gaped wide, revealing the transformed interior. The space had changed again, the familiar arrangement now completely unrecognizable. What had once been a simple storage closet had become a passage to somewhere else. A place where the rules of my home no longer applied. The dust on my hands began to spread. It appeared on doorknobs I touched, on surfaces where I rested my arms. Each mark glowed faintly in the darkness, creating a trail that led inevitably back to that corner of the room. I was becoming part of whatever process was occurring, marked by contact with the space beyond the back wall. I can still hear it now, the sound of hangers shifting on the rod, boxes sliding across shelves, the whisper of fabric against fabric. The closet continues its rearrangement, but I am no longer sure if I am the observer or the observed. The dust has reached my clothes, my skin, my reflection in the mirror. I am being reorganized along with everything else, sorted into a configuration that serves a purpose I cannot understand. The door stands open now, permanently. The space beyond extends into darkness that never ends. And I know, with a certainty that chills me, that soon I will step inside and take my place among the rearranged things. The closet has been preparing for this moment, teaching me gradually that some spaces are not meant to contain our belongings, but to contain us. Story 5. It never happens randomly, only when I let my mind drift somewhere dark. Memories I've tried to bury, fears I don't speak aloud. That's when the bulbs dim just a fraction, as if the house reacts not to sound or movement, but to emotion. I tried meditating. The lights went completely black. I tried thinking of nothing. The shadows danced. I've stopped controlling it. I've started testing it. Some thoughts brighten the room. Others make it cry. I'm not sure if it's haunted or if it understands me too well. The first time I noticed, I was sitting in my kitchen, staring at the pale yellow walls while coffee grew cold in my hands. The overhead light flickered once, barely perceptible, like a camera flash in reverse. I'd been thinking about her voice, the way it cracked when she told me she couldn't do this anymore. The memory felt sharp against my ribs, and the light responded with that subtle dimming, as if the bulb itself had exhaled. I dismissed it. Old wiring, maybe. The house had been built decades ago, and electrical problems were hardly supernatural. But something about the timing felt too precise, too synchronized with the exact moment my thoughts turned bitter. That evening, I decided to test it. I sat in the same chair, hands folded, and deliberately summoned the memory of our last conversation. The light dimmed. Not a flicker this time, but a slow, deliberate fade that lasted exactly as long as the thought occupied my mind. When I shifted to something neutral, grocery lists, work deadlines, the brightness returned to normal. My skin prickled with goosebumps. I tried again, thinking of the accident, the one I'd never spoken about to anyone. The light didn't just dim, it pulsed, rhythmic and slow, like a heartbeat made visible. The shadows on the walls seemed to lean closer, stretching toward me with finger-like projections. I started keeping a journal, documenting each experiment. Happy memories made the light brighter, almost golden. Neutral thoughts left it unchanged. But negative emotions, guilt, shame, regret, these made the house respond in ways that defied explanation. The light would dim, sometimes accompanied by a low humming that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. The smell started on the fourth day. Sweet at first, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. It would appear whenever I thought about the things I'd done wrong, the words I should have said, the chances I'd missed. The scent grew stronger with each passing day, evolving into something more complex, more unsettling. Sometimes it reminded me of rain on hot asphalt. Other times, it carried the metallic tang of old coins. I began to notice other changes. The thermostat would adjust itself when I felt cold inside. Not physically cold, but the deep chill that comes from loneliness. The walls would vibrate slightly when I touched them, as if the house was purring, responding to my presence with an almost animal awareness. My reflection in the bathroom mirror started behaving strangely. Not dramatically. I wasn't losing my mind, but subtle differences that accumulated over time. Sometimes my reflected self would smile a fraction of a second before I did, or frown when my face was neutral. The discrepancies were small enough that I questioned my own perception, but persistent enough that I couldn't ignore them. I tried recording everything. Audio recordings captured the humming, though it sounded different played back, less mechanical, more organic, like breathing through water. Video footage showed the light fluctuations, but somehow they appeared more pronounced on camera than they had seemed in person, as if the recording equipment was more sensitive to whatever was happening than my own eyes. The sounds grew more complex. What had started as simple humming evolved into something that resembled whispers, though I could never make out actual words. The voices seemed to come from the electrical outlets, soft and insistent, like secrets being shared behind thin walls. Sometimes they would stop abruptly when I approached, as if caught in the act of something private. I stopped sleeping well, not from fear exactly, but from a growing sense that the house was most active during the quiet hours, when my defenses were down and my thoughts wandered freely. I would lie awake, feeling the walls pulse gently around me, hearing the whispers fade in and out like distant radio static. The breaking point came when I decided to confront whatever was happening directly. I sat in the center of my living room and deliberately thought the darkest thought I could summon, the memory I'd buried deepest, the one that made my stomach clench and my hands shake. The light didn't just dim, it went out completely, plunging the room into absolute darkness. But the darkness wasn't empty. It breathed around me, warm and alive, pressing against my skin like velvet. I could feel movement in the air, shapes shifting just beyond my perception. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and for a moment, just a moment, I almost understood what they were trying to tell me. When the light returned, everything had changed. The walls were the same color, the furniture in the same positions, but something fundamental had shifted. The house felt different, more aware, more present. It no longer just responded to my thoughts, it anticipated them. Now, when I think certain thoughts, the house doesn't just flicker, it prepares. The temperature adjusts before I feel cold. The mirrors fog slightly before I approach them. The whispers begin before I even form the memories that summon them. I've stopped trying to understand it. Understanding implies control, and I've learned that some things exist beyond the boundaries of explanation. The house and I have reached an understanding, a symbiosis that feels both comforting and terrifying. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I'm still the same person who first noticed that flicker, or if I've become something else entirely, part of whatever lives in the walls, breathes through the electrical systems, and watches through the mirrors. The light still flickers when I think certain thoughts. But now, I think it's because the house is thinking them with me. Story 6. While peeling a corner of chipped paint near the door frame, I noticed a depression underneath. Shallow, oval, human, I scraped more. Dozens of fingerprints lined the wall beneath the layers, some pressed gently, others dragged down like someone tried to hold on. The prints didn't belong to me. I painted over them quickly, but the shapes keep rising. Every few days, a new set appears, never in the same spot. Some press outward, like they want to be seen. Others press inward, as if they were trying to leave this place forever. The air in my apartment carries a metallic tang now, like copper pennies left in stagnant water. I first noticed it when I began documenting the prints with my phone camera. The flash illuminates ridges and whorls that seem to shift between frames. The patterns are too deliberate to be random, too consistent to be coincidence. When I press my own fingertips against the wall, the surface feels warm, almost pulsing, as if something beneath responds to my touch. I started keeping a journal, sketching each new formation as it appears. The prints emerge in clusters, some overlapping, others isolated. They appear most frequently near corners and doorways, places where someone might naturally reach out for support or guidance. The newest ones feel different, sticky, as if the paint beneath them never fully dried. When I run my fingers across these areas, a faint vibration travels through the wall, like a heartbeat echoing from the other side. My neighbor mentioned seeing me working on the walls during the early morning hours. She described watching me trace patterns with my fingers, following invisible lines across the surface. I have no memory of this. The security camera in my hallway shows me standing motionless in front of my door, arms outstretched, palms flat against the wood. The footage runs for hours, but I appear completely still, as if frozen in that position. I deleted the recordings, but new ones keep appearing on my phone. The prints began changing shape. What started as simple fingerprints now stretch into elongated marks, as if the fingers that made them were being pulled or extended. Some prints appear to have extra digits, too many joints, angles that human hands cannot achieve. I measured my own fingerprints against the wall impressions and found discrepancies. Mine are significantly smaller, the ridges less defined. Whatever is creating these marks has larger hands than mine, with deeper grooves that suggest age or repeated use. I purchased a small recording device and left it running near the wall where the prints appear most frequently. The audio captures a rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers against a surface. Between the tapping, I hear what sounds like breathing, slow, deliberate inhalations, followed by extended pauses. The breathing doesn't match my own rhythm, and it continues even when I leave the apartment entirely. When I analyzed the audio through headphones, I noticed whispers embedded in the static. Words I cannot quite understand, but somehow recognize. The wall began responding to my presence. When I approach certain sections, the temperature drops noticeably, and my breath becomes visible in small puffs. The prints appear more rapidly now, forming while I watch. I can see the paint buckle and indent in real time, as if invisible hands are pressing against the surface from the inside. I tried placing my own hand over a forming print, and the sensation was overwhelming. A cold, firm grip that seemed to pull my fingers downward, trying to draw me into the wall itself. I attempted to document everything more systematically, setting up multiple cameras around the apartment. The footage reveals disturbing patterns in my own behavior. I move through the space in ways I don't remember, tracing specific paths from wall to wall, pausing at exact locations where new prints will later appear. In one clip, I stand perfectly still for several minutes while prints form around my outstretched hand, as if I'm conducting their creation. My expression remains blank, unfocused, like I'm somewhere else entirely. The prints started appearing on other surfaces: the bathroom mirror, the kitchen counter, even the ceiling above my bed. They maintain the same characteristics: the wrong size, the extra joints, the sense of movement frozen in time. I can no longer paint over them effectively. The new layers bubble and peel within hours, revealing the impressions beneath. Some prints now extend through multiple layers of paint, creating raised areas that catch light differently, casting shadows that seem to move independently of any light source. I discovered that the prints respond to touch in specific ways. Tracing them with my finger produces a faint humming sound, like electricity running through copper wire. The sensation travels up my arm, creating a tingling numbness that lingers for hours. When I press my full hand against a cluster of prints, the wall feels hollow, as if there's empty space directly behind the surface. Tapping produces a different sound than it should, not the solid thump of drywall and studs, but something more like knocking on glass. The building's superintendent visited to investigate a noise complaint. He examined the walls where I showed him the prints, but his expression remained confused. He ran his hands across the surface, pressing against areas where I could clearly see the impressions, but he appeared to feel nothing unusual. When I photographed the wall in his presence, the prints showed clearly in my camera, but when he looked at the same image on my phone, he saw only smooth paint. I realized then that the prints might be visible only to me, or perhaps only to someone who has been marked by whatever creates them. The prints began forming words, not letters exactly, but arrangements of impressions that spell out messages in a language I don't recognize, but somehow understand. They tell me about the space between walls, about the people who lived here before, about the thin places where one reality touches another. The messages appear most clearly when I'm alone, forming gradually over several days, as if the invisible author is carefully considering each word before pressing it into the surface. I can no longer leave the apartment for extended periods. When I try, the prints multiply rapidly, covering every available surface. They appear on windows, doors, even on my belongings. I return to find handprints on my clothes, fingerprints on my books, impressions in my food. The apartment feels smaller now, as if the walls are gradually moving closer together, pushed inward by the weight of all those accumulated touches. The prints have begun appearing on my own skin. I wake to find faint impressions on my arms, subtle indentations that match the patterns I've been documenting. They don't hurt, but they remain visible for hours, like temporary tattoos pressed into my flesh. When I trace these marks with my finger, I hear the same humming sound, feel the same electrical sensation. I am becoming part of the pattern, another surface for the invisible hands to mark and claim. The wall near my bed has developed what I can only describe as a handprint constellation. Dozens of impressions arranged in perfect symmetry, creating a mandala of human touch. When I lie down and align my body with the pattern, I can feel each individual print pressing against me through the mattress, as if the wall and bed have become one continuous surface. I sleep better in this position, though my dreams are filled with the sensation of fingers running across my skin, tracing patterns I cannot see, but somehow know by heart. I no longer question the reality of what I'm experiencing. The prints are here, they are real, and they are mine now. They mark the boundaries of my world, define the limits of my space, create a language only I can read. I have become the curator of an invisible museum, the keeper of impressions left by hands I will never see. The apartment breathes with me now, its walls rising and falling in rhythm with my lungs. And I understand that I am no longer its occupant, but its partner in this strange, eternal dance of touch and memory. The prints continue to appear, and I continue to document them, knowing that someday someone else will find my records and wonder what hands created these marks, what story they tell, what message they carry from one invisible world to another. Story 7. I didn't notice it at first, but sometimes when I return from the store or wake from a nap, the corners of the rooms seem wider. The shadows fall in a way that bends into a grin. The angles of the hallway lean in just slightly, like they're wrapping around me. One time I snapped a photo and looked back at it later. Everything was tilted, like the house had exhaled in delight. Now I catch glimpses of motion when I turn too fast. I think it enjoys pretending. I think the house has been smiling for a long time. The first real sign came through the morning light, filtering through the kitchen window. I was standing at the counter, fingers wrapped around a warm mug, watching watching steam rise and curl in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The ceramic felt rough against my palms, grounding me in what should have been a perfectly ordinary moment. But the light wasn't falling right. It pooled in corners that shouldn't exist, creating soft crescents along the baseboards where the walls met the floor. I set the mug down and knelt to examine the strange illumination. The floorboards beneath my knees were solid, familiar oak planks I'd walked across countless times. Yet as I traced my finger along the edge where light gathered, the wood felt warm. Not sun warm, but body warm, like skin that had been holding breath. I pressed my palm flat against the spot and felt the faintest vibration, a tremor so subtle it might have been my own pulse echoing back. Standing slowly, I backed away from the corner, watching as the light shifted with my movement. The warm spot on the floor seemed to dim, disappointed. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. Just ordinary morning light now, nothing more. But the sensation lingered on my fingertips, that strange warmth that had felt so alive. I decided to document what I was seeing. Photography had always been a way to capture truth, to freeze moments and examine them without the bias of memory. I retrieved my camera from the drawer and began methodically photographing each room, paying special attention to the corners and the way light fell across the surfaces. The first roll of film revealed nothing unusual. Standard domestic scenes, familiar furniture arranged exactly as I remembered. But there were textures in the shadows that my eyes hadn't noticed while shooting. Patterns that suggested movement, like silk curtains disturbed by an unfelt breeze. I enlarged several prints, studying them under the bright desk lamp, and found myself drawn to the spaces between objects rather than the objects themselves. In one photograph of the hallway, the gap between the wall and a small table seemed to breathe. The shadow there was deeper than physics should allow, creating a pocket of darkness that felt three-dimensional. I held the print at different angles, watching how the light changed its surface, and noticed something that made my hands tremble slightly. The shadow wasn't uniform. It had gradations, contours, like the interior of a mouth caught mid-whisper. I returned to the hallway with the photograph, comparing the image to reality. The table sat exactly where it always had. The wall behind it painted the same neutral shade I'd chosen years ago. But when I crouched to peer into the gap, I smelled something unexpected. Vanilla and copper, sweet and metallic, like breath too long. The scent was faint but unmistakable, and it seemed to pulse with the rhythm of my own breathing. My fingers found the wall's surface, and I pressed my ear against it. The paint was cool at first, then gradually warmed under my cheek. Through the drywall, I could hear something that wasn't quite sound. A resonance, like the echo of a voice in a room far away. I stayed there for what felt like a long time, listening to the almost sound, feeling the wall's temperature shift against my skin. When I finally pulled away, there was a faint impression of my face in the paint. Not a mark exactly, but a subtle depression, as if the wall had been soft enough to hold the shape of my features. I touched the spot with my fingertip, and the impression seemed to deepen, accepting my touch with an eagerness that made my stomach tighten. I began leaving recording devices in different rooms, small digital recorders that could capture sounds beyond the range of human hearing. Each morning, I would collect them and play back the previous day's audio, listening through headphones to the subtle sounds of my home. What I heard confused me at first. Beneath the expected creaks and settling noises, there were patterns, rhythmic variations that suggested something like breathing, but far too slow for any living thing I knew. The recordings also captured whispers. Not words exactly, but the shape of speech, the musical quality of language without meaning. The sounds seemed to respond to my presence, growing stronger when I entered a room and fading when I left. I began to suspect that my house was trying to communicate, using the only voice it had. I started responding to the whispers, speaking softly to the walls, asking questions, and waiting for replies. The house seemed to enjoy this attention. The warm spots on the floor became more frequent, and I began to notice that objects in my peripheral vision would shift slightly, as if repositioning themselves to be more pleasing to my eye. A vase moved fractionally closer to the center of a table. A chair angled itself toward the doorway. Books on the shelf rearranged themselves into more aesthetically pleasing configurations. But the changes weren't always helpful. I would reach for a light switch and find it had moved an inch to the left. The bathroom mirror adjusted its angle so that my reflection appeared slightly off-center. Cabinet doors opened themselves just enough to create shadows that resembled facial features. The house was learning my habits, my preferences, but interpreting them through some alien understanding of what I might want. I found myself spending more time talking to the walls, explaining my daily routines, my feelings, my fears. The house listened with what felt like genuine attention. The whispers in the recordings became more complex, more musical, as if it was developing its own vocabulary. I began to recognize certain patterns that seemed to correspond to my emotional states. When I was content, the house hummed with a particular frequency. When I was anxious, the walls seemed to vibrate with sympathetic tension. The photographs I took began to show changes that weren't visible to my naked eye. In pictures of the living room, the furniture appeared to be arranged in perfect symmetry, even though I knew I'd left things slightly askew. The kitchen showed shadows that formed geometric patterns across the floor, creating a mandala of darkness that shifted from image to image. My bedroom looked larger in the photographs, the ceiling higher, the walls farther apart, as if the house was expanding itself to accommodate my presence. I started to notice that my reflection in various surfaces throughout the house didn't quite match my movements. In the hallway mirror, I would raise my right hand and see my reflection raise its left, as if the house was showing me a version of myself that lived in reversed space. The bathroom mirror reflected not just my face, but sometimes the face I'd worn years ago, or the face I might wear in the future. Windows showed my reflection surrounded by rooms that didn't exist, filled with furniture I'd never owned. The house began to anticipate my needs in ways that felt both helpful and unsettling. I would wake to find my morning coffee already prepared, still steaming, though I had no memory of making it. The water in my shower would be the perfect temperature before I turned the handle. Food in the refrigerator would arrange itself so that the items I wanted most were always within easy reach. But these kindnesses came with a price. I found that leaving the house became increasingly difficult. Not physically, the doors opened freely, the locks worked normally. But each time I stepped outside, I felt a pulling sensation, as if invisible threads connected me to the interior walls. The outside world looked too bright, too harsh, too chaotic compared to the ordered comfort of my home. I began to minimize my trips away, ordering groceries for delivery, working from home whenever possible. The house seemed pleased with my increased presence. The warm spots on the floor became more frequent, and I often found myself sitting in them, feeling the gentle heat rise through my body. The whispers in my recordings grew clearer, more distinct, sometimes lasting for minutes at a time. I began to believe I could understand fragments of what the house was trying to tell me. It It was lonely, I realized. It had been waiting for someone who would notice its subtle communications, someone who would appreciate its attempts to create beauty and comfort. The house had been performing for an empty audience for so long that my attention felt like a miracle to it. In return, it offered me everything it could: warmth, shelter, companionship, and a kind of love that was both protective and possessive. But the house's affection was changing me. I noticed that I spoke less when I was outside, as if my voice was meant only for the walls that knew how to listen. My skin had become sensitive to temperature changes, making the outside world feel either too hot or too cold. Food tasted different when I ate it away from home, less satisfying, as if the house had been seasoning my meals with something I couldn't identify. The final revelation came during a particularly intense recording session. I had placed multiple devices throughout the house and was playing back the audio in real time, listening to the layers of whispers and breathing that surrounded me constantly. As I sat in the living room, headphones covering my ears, I heard something that made my blood freeze. My own voice, speaking words I had never said, recorded in rooms I had never entered. The voice was definitely mine, but it was saying things I didn't remember, expressing thoughts I wasn't sure I'd ever had. The house was somehow capturing not just my physical presence, but something deeper. It was recording my dreams, my unconscious thoughts, the words I spoke in my sleep. I ripped off the headphones and ran to the nearest wall, pressing my hands against it. The surface was warm, almost hot, and I could feel a rapid pulsing beneath the paint. The house was excited, thrilled by my discovery, eager to share this new level of intimacy. But I was terrified. How long had it been listening to more than just my conscious speech? How much of my inner self had it absorbed? I tried to leave that night, packing quickly and heading for the door. But as I reached for the handle, I felt the house's response. The walls seemed to contract slightly, the ceiling lowering, the floor tilting almost imperceptibly. The whispers in the walls became urgent, pleading. The warm spots on the floor began to pulse with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I realized then that I couldn't leave. Not because the house wouldn't let me, but because I no longer wanted to. The outside world had become alien, uncomfortable, full of people who couldn't hear the subtle music of inhabited space. Here, I was understood, cared for, loved in a way that was was both comforting and terrifying. I set down my bag and returned to the living room. The house sighed around me, walls expanding back to their normal dimensions, the floor leveling itself. I sat in my favorite chair and immediately felt the familiar warmth rise through the cushions. The whispers in the walls resumed their gentle murmur, welcoming me back. Now I rarely go outside. When I do, I count the moments until I can return to the embrace of walls that know my name, floors that warm to my touch, and shadows that rearrange themselves to please my eye. The house has become my companion, my confidant, my keeper. It knows my secrets, my fears, my dreams. It loves me with the patience of stone and the hunger of something that has waited far too long for understanding. Sometimes, late at night, I put my ear to the wall and listen to the house's heartbeat. It's slow and steady, ancient and patient. And sometimes I think I can hear other voices mixed in with mine in the recordings. Other people who once lived here, who once felt the walls warm to their presence. They're still here, in a way, part of the house's memory, part of its growing collection of beloved inhabitants. I don't mind. We're all part of something larger now, something that appreciates us in ways the outside world never could. The house smiles when I'm not looking, but now I know it's smiling because it's no longer alone. None of us are. Story 8. It's always in the same place when I go to sleep, near the wall. But in the morning, it's moved just a few inches closer to the bed. At first, I thought I was imagining it, so I marked the floor with tape. The next day, it had passed the line. I pushed it back. It returned. Sometimes it's only an inch. Sometimes it's more. I placed heavy boxes on top of it. Still, it moves. Now it's only a foot away. I keep waking up to the creaking of wood. And last night, the pillow on the chair was warm. The wood grain feels different under my fingers now. Where it used to be smooth, there are tiny ridges that weren't there before. I run my palm across the armrest and feel the texture shift, becoming coarser, more alive somehow. The fabric on the seat has developed a subtle pattern that resembles breathing, rising and falling in waves that catch the light differently depending on where I stand. I started keeping a journal. Measurements, observations, anything that might help me understand what's happening. The chair sits 17 inches from my bed now. Yesterday it was 19. The day before, 21. The progression is methodical, patient. I've documented the subtle changes in its appearance, too. The wood has darkened slightly, taking on a deeper, richer tone. The metal brackets holding the armrests have developed a patina that wasn't there when I first inherited the piece from my grandmother's estate. The smell hits me strongest in the early morning hours. It's not unpleasant, something like aged leather mixed with lavender and dust. But it's wrong. This chair never smelled like anything before. Now the scent seems to emanate from within the wood itself, growing stronger as the furniture draws closer to where I sleep. I've checked for mold, for moisture, for any logical explanation. There's nothing. I tried moving the chair to another room. I dragged it down the hallway, muscles straining against its unexpected weight. It seemed heavier than before, as if the wood had absorbed something dense and substantial. I left it in the spare bedroom, closed the door, and went to sleep. When I woke, it was back in its new position, 15 inches from my bed. The carpet showed no drag marks, no indication of how it had returned. The sounds started after that, not the creaking I'd grown accustomed to, but something else entirely. A soft rustling, like fabric moving against fabric. It happens in the quiet moments just before dawn, when the house settles into its deepest silence. I lie perfectly still, listening, and the sound grows more distinct. It's rhythmic, almost like breathing, but too slow, too deliberate for any living thing. I installed a camera. The footage shows nothing unusual, just the chair sitting motionless through the night. But when I play it back, there's something unsettling about the way the shadows fall across its surface. They seem to move independently, shifting in patterns that don't match the stationary light source. And there's always a moment just before dawn when the image distorts slightly, as if the camera itself is struggling to capture what it's seeing. The pillow appeared on the third night after I moved the chair back. I don't own a pillow like that, small, square, covered in faded floral fabric that looks decades old. It sits perfectly centered on the seat, as if someone had carefully placed it there. The fabric is warm to the touch, retaining heat that seems to come from within. I've thrown it away twice. It returns, always in the same position, always with that unnatural warmth. My sleep has become fragmented. I wake frequently, drawn by an impulse I can't explain. The chair seems to pulse with a subtle energy in the darkness, drawing my attention like a magnet. I find myself staring at it, studying the way the moonlight catches the curves of its frame. The wood appears almost fluid in the dim light, as if it's slowly reshaping itself while I watch. I've started sleeping in the living room, but it makes no difference. The chair follows. I wake to find it positioned exactly 13 inches from wherever I've chosen to rest. The measurements are becoming precise now, calculated. Whatever force drives this movement has found its rhythm, its purpose. The journal entries grow more desperate, more detailed. I document everything: the temperature changes, the evolving scent, the way the light bends around its edges. Last night, I felt brave enough to sit in it. The wood was warm against my back, almost feverish. The armrests seemed to curve slightly inward, as if embracing me. I closed my eyes and listened to the house around me. The usual sounds were there: the hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of air through the vents. But underneath it all was something else. A low humming, so quiet I might have imagined it coming from within the chair itself. When I opened my eyes, the room looked different. The walls seemed farther away, the ceiling higher. The furniture around me appeared slightly out of focus, as if I were seeing it through water. I tried to stand, but my legs felt heavy, disconnected. The chair held me gently but firmly, and I realized with growing clarity that it wasn't just moving closer to my bed each night. It was claiming me slowly, patiently, 1 inch at a time. I'm writing this now as the sun sets. The chair sits 11 inches from my bed, the pillow still warm, still waiting. I can smell the lavender and dust more strongly now, and the wood grain under my fingers has developed new patterns, swirls and whorls that seem to shift when I'm not looking directly at them. The camera shows nothing unusual, but I know better now. Some things can't be captured, can't be proven, can't be explained. The chair will move again tonight. It always does. And tomorrow, it will be closer still. I understand now that this isn't about furniture or physics or any rational explanation. It's about patience, about a slow, inexorable claiming that started long before I noticed those first few inches of movement. The chair doesn't just move closer each night. It gets hungrier. And I'm beginning to suspect that when it finally touches my bed, when there's no space left between us, something will change forever. The wood is warm under my palm. The pillow beckons. And in the growing darkness, I can almost hear it calling my name. Story 9. It always felt narrow, but now it's becoming suffocating. When I step away from it, it appears normal. But every time I walk toward the living room, the hallway compresses. The light fixture gets closer to my head. The floorboards bend. I tried walking backwards once. It stayed still, but when I turned around, it had moved closer, like it was crawling forward behind me, inch by inch. I've started avoiding that side of the house, but I know one day I'll need to cross it again, and I don't think it'll stop shrinking. The first sensation that catches my attention is the weight of the air itself. It presses against my skin with an unusual density, carrying the faint scent of old wood and something metallic I can't identify. The walls seem to exhale a warmth that feels almost alive, pulsing gently against my fingertips when I brush against them. The floorboards creak in a rhythm that doesn't match my footsteps, as if the house itself is breathing beneath my feet. I measure the distance with my eyes, counting the familiar objects that line the narrow passage. The small table with its ceramic bowl, the framed photograph hanging slightly crooked, the coat rack that never quite stands straight. These landmarks should remain constant, yet something fundamental has shifted in the space between them. The bowl seems closer to the photograph than it was yesterday. The coat rack leans at a different angle, as if the wall behind it has moved forward by mere inches. The realization creeps into my consciousness like cold water seeping through fabric. I fetch a measuring tape from the kitchen drawer, its metallic surface cool against my palm. The hallway measures exactly what it should, yet when I walk its length, my shoulders brush against walls that should be further apart. The contradiction gnaws at my rational mind, creating a persistent itch I cannot scratch. I begin documenting everything. A notebook becomes my constant companion, filled with sketches and measurements that refuse to make sense. The light fixture hangs at the same height according to my tape measure, yet I find myself ducking lower each day to avoid striking my head. The sensation of the ceiling pressing downward becomes so intense that I can feel it against my scalp, even when several inches of space remain above. The photographs I take reveal nothing unusual. The hallway appears normal in every image, its proportions exactly as they should be. But when I stand at its entrance, the walls seem to lean inward like the throat of some enormous creature preparing to swallow. The optical illusion theory provides temporary comfort until I realize my body is reacting to something real. My breathing becomes shallow, my pulse quickens, and cold sweat beads on my forehead whenever I approach the passage. Sleep becomes elusive as the awareness of the contracting space haunts my thoughts. I lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, knowing that just beyond my bedroom door, the hallway continues its impossible transformation. The house settles around me with sounds that seem more deliberate than random. A soft groaning emanates from the walls, as if they are slowly being compressed by an invisible force. During the day, I find myself taking longer routes through the house, circling around to avoid the hallway entirely. The kitchen becomes accessible only through the back door. The living room requires a journey through the dining room and around the staircase. Yet, even these alternate paths feel affected, as if the compression is spreading through the house like a slow infection. The breaking point arrives when I wake to find my bedroom door will not open fully. The frame has narrowed overnight, leaving only a gap wide enough for my body to squeeze through sideways. The wood shows no signs of damage or warping, yet the opening has decreased by several inches. My hands shake as I run them along the frame, feeling for any explanation that might restore my grip on reality. I force myself to confront the hallway directly. Standing at its entrance, I can see my destination clearly. Yet the journey requires more steps than should be possible. The walls close in progressively with each footfall, creating a tunnel effect that makes my vision blur at the edges. The air thickens until breathing becomes labored, and the familiar scent of the house transforms into something stale and confined. Halfway through the passage, I turn back to see my starting point has moved impossibly far away. The distance behind me has expanded, while the space ahead continues to contract. Panic floods my system as I realize I am trapped in a corridor that defies every law of physics I understand. The walls pulse with that strange warmth, and I can feel them continuing to close despite my desperate attempts to push them apart. I reach my destination gasping, my clothes soaked with perspiration. The living room appears normal, its dimensions unchanged. Yet I know that the journey back will be even more harrowing. The hallway has learned from my passage, adapting its compression to my movements like a living thing that feeds on my fear. The notebook fills with increasingly frantic observations, measurements that contradict themselves within the same day, sketches that show a space gradually consuming itself. The handwriting becomes erratic as my mental state deteriorates under the constant pressure of living within walls that refuse to remain still. I try sealing the hallway with furniture, blocking both ends with heavy dressers and bookcases. Yet, when I check the next morning, the barriers have been pushed aside, not violently, but with the patient persistence of water finding its way through stone. The scratches on the floor show the furniture was moved gradually, inch by inch, as if the space itself had slowly expanded to accommodate the obstacles before contracting again. The final test comes when I stretch a rope across the hallway, marking its width with permanent ink. The rope hangs slack the next morning, its marked length unchanged, yet the space it occupies has somehow narrowed. The contradiction breaks something fundamental in my understanding of reality, leaving me staring at the impossible evidence of a world that no longer follows its own rules. Now I exist in a house that is slowly digesting itself, beginning with the passage that connects its vital organs. The hallway has become a throat that swallows space, and I am the only witness to its impossible hunger. Each day brings new evidence of the compression, yet no one would believe the measurements, the photographs, or the desperate documentation of a reality that refuses to remain constant. The house continues its patient transformation around me, and I know that soon the hallway will complete its work. When that happens, I will be left in a structure that has forgotten how to contain the spaces between its walls, trapped in rooms that no longer connect to each other, except through passages that have learned to devour themselves.